There is this myth, I think, that you just have sexual instincts and you follow them. And when you do decide to have sex with them, it is, if you are truly sexually compatible, you'll just kind of fall onto each other and do stuff and it'll all work.
Welcome to Sleeping Around, where we offer a peek behind the curtain of modern sex and relationship therapy and research, bringing you insights and conversations otherwise reserved for the therapy room. I'm your host, Elena Joy, a Master's of Counseling Psychology student, content creator, and lifelong sex and relationship nerd. Enjoy the episode. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of Sleeping Around. Today's guest is Nadine Thornhill. She is an award-winning sexuality educator, speaker, and content creator based in Toronto, Ontario. With almost 20 years of experience, hi Bugs, Nadine has helped thousands of adults and youth learn and communicate openly about consent, pleasure, relationships, and sexuality. And those are exactly the topics that we cover in this episode. We talk about sex-positive education in schools. We have a really interesting discussion around sex education and abstinence-only beliefs and whether or not they can coexist, how they can coexist. I had my worldview expanded through this conversation, and so I hope it can do the same for you. We also talk about teaching youth about sex. We talk about how asexuality fits into sex education, queerness, addressing bigotry or ignorance in schools, and how we can make a difference even when things like comprehensive sex education are being outlawed in schools. This is a really important topic, and I hope that you enjoy the episode. How about start by telling us a little bit about you, a little bit about what you do?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm a sex educator. That's my job. In other parts of my life, I am a parent to a teenager. I'm a partner. I live on the unceded territory of the Anishinaabe and the Huron-Wendat and the Mississaugas of the Credit, known by its colonial name, Toronto, Canada.
Well, it's nice to officially meet you.
It's really nice to meet you
face
too.
To face in this
Exactly.
way. So I'm in so-called Vancouver, which is the unceded territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. I really appreciate the land acknowledgement. So how did you get into sex education or the work that you do?
My career plans when I was a young person, from the time I was actually a child, I wanted to be an actor. I wanted to be in theater. I went to school and studied theater. And while I was at school, met a guy. He is now my partner. And when we graduated, he got a job in Ottawa. And for listeners who may be outside of Canada, Ottawa is Canada's capital. So we moved there, and I needed to have my day jobs while I was pursuing my theater gigs. And there was a store in Ottawa called Venus Envy. It was like a sex-positive, queer-positive community space and retail space, and heard through the grapevine, through like friends of friends, that they were hiring. So I was like, oh, that would be a fun day job, like selling dildos and whatnot. They also did education. They did workshops. And so the manager, after a couple of months, was like, do you want to get into workshop facilitation? I was like, yeah, sure. Like, it's extra money. It seems like fun. Like, did some training and some reading, and I co-facilitated my first workshop. And it really sparked something in me. And what felt so gratifying and just amazing was seeing how quickly people sort of embraced being in a space where we could have conversations about aspects of their sexuality that they had clearly been like questioning or had curiosity around, but I guess they didn't know, like, it's okay to talk about this, like it's fine. And seeing how quickly people would open up and how willing people were to talk about things that seemed to have been on their mind for such a long time. And there was this sort of palpable feeling of, like, I don't know, like relief and relaxation in the room. And at the same time, sort of seeing that happen for other people, I realized, like, this is something that could be really transformative for me as well. And then being able to hear different people's perspectives, different people's experiences, and sort of noticing, even in that first workshop, I was like, there are definitely these sort of common threads in terms of the emotions, the drive, the desire, like the desire to connect, the desire to feel validated, the desire to experience pleasure in their bodies. There was also a commonality in people feeling maybe insecure or unsure about, whether what they were feeling and experiencing and desiring and not desiring were normal. But then there was also a great variety in the specifics of how that played out for people. And I was like, why aren't we all talking about this? Like, I think we're all like just yes. quietly, having these experiences, these thoughts, these questions, these insecurities, and we're not saying anything. So at first I was like, okay, this is fun. I love this. Like, can I do more of this, please? I remember I got 4 or 5 emails from different people all saying, hey, Planned Parenthood Ottawa is looking for a theater coordinator for some youth sex ed program. And this seems like a thing that might be up your alley. And I was like, yeah, it does.
You're like, yeah, just a little bit. Yeah.
Theater, sex ed, yeah. I think I can handle it. And so I was the coordinator for something called Insight Theater. It was basically like this really fun theater sex ed camp. So this was like a long established program. It had a really high reputation. I don't know how I never heard of it. We would give them the Ontario curriculum guidelines for sexual development, which are part of the health and phys ed curriculum. And we would look at the subjects that were covered in the grade 7, grade 8, and grade 9 curriculums, and they would take those subjects, use the theater principles to create a series of sketches, skits, songs, and put it all together in a show. Because these kids were the same age, basically, as kids in schools in these grades, that they would have a perspective on what would be relevant to them and how to present the material. And then for the rest of the school year, we would tour around to schools in the Ottawa Carleton District School Board.
I'm so surprised by that because it feels like such a leap from, the in-school sex education where you separate the boys and the girls and the gym teacher for some reason comes in and teaches you.
Yeah, because it's part of phys ed.
And that kind of, as far as my experience was, kind of being the standard for sex education in schools, it seems like such a leap to then have this entire program dedicated to sexuality education for youth, and to then go like almost youth-led also in a way.
Yeah, it was.
To then come into the schools, I'm amazed.
It was phenomenal. Our troop they were also trained in like very basic sort of peer-to-peer counseling techniques. So, they were available to talk to youth afterwards. I was also there.
Wow, yeah.
It was so much fun. And because I was the director, the coordinator, I did all of the communication with parents, with teachers. So what I was getting at that time was a lot of feedback from adults talking about how much they appreciated the program, but also how much they wanted to be able to facilitate these conversations with their students, with their kids at home, with kids in their group, with family members, but also feeling like, I don't know how to do this. How do I do this? And this is okay. You can talk about this the same way you talk about anything else you talk to your kids about. And it's generally going to basically go the same way. And when it gets awkward, it's awkward because you feel awkward.
It sounds like what you're describing with the parents, what you're describing with the kids, mirrors that initial experience in the sex shop. All of these spaces that you're entering, the folks that you're working with, there's this kind of collective sigh of like, oh, we've been wanting to talk about this stuff, or I've been having these thoughts, or I have these questions, and I don't know I haven't had somebody to have that conversation with. And it's kind of incredible to hear that throughout all these different spaces have this through line of curiosity and openness and like desire for these conversations. It's kind of sad because you know that there are all these people out there who maybe don't cross your path.
That was me also for a long time. And so that's sort of what led me into wanting to start a private practice, because I kept thinking, this is such valuable knowledge to me, like as a human, as a parent, as a partner. I often say to people, sex is a subset of sexuality. And then people sometimes are like, well, what is sexuality? And I'm like, well, I think that sexuality is basically how we human. It's how we human. I'm like, it's like intelligence. It's like emotions. It's just this intrinsic integrated part of our humanity. And there are these specific aspects of it that we name sexuality. It is weird to me that it isn't something that is sort of just part of our fundamental discussions and our fundamental, that it is sort of siloed off as though it is this like completely separate, discrete part of us that exists in a like very specific sort of box that needs to be like shut away and that is not accessed and like we have no awareness or no connection to it until some arbitrary age, depending on what society you function in, or some arbitrary life stage where we're like, oh, now it becomes relevant. And then you just suddenly know.
Yeah. Like in what other area of life do we expect this? Other than maybe motherhood?
Yeah.
Parenthood, possibly?
Parenthood.
There's like an expectation you're going to just magically know.
You just know.
But other than that,
there are things that we practice.
Yes.
There is this myth, I think, that you just kind of know. You just have sexual instincts and you follow them and then it's fine. Like the most prevalent myth being if you are someone who experiences sexual attraction and you have a sexual partner that, you know, sex is a thing that you want to have all the time with them. And if you don't, you're broken. And number two, that when you do decide to have sex with them, it is, if you are truly sexually compatible, I put that in air quotes for folks listening because I don't believe in that actually, you'll just kind of fall onto each other and do stuff and it'll all work. And nobody has to like say anything or ask for anything or plan anything or negotiate anything or be like, let's try this a few times. Again,
plenty of orgasms.
Plenty of orgasms. And I'm like, if you are a sexually active person, I'm like, sex is a practice. If like consent is a practice, communication is a practice, understanding your own body is a practice. I think even many of the ways we express sort of what we think of as the sexual components of our identity, you know, our sexual expression, our sexual romantic orientations, our gender expressions, like all of those things, I'm like, there is an element of practice in how we incorporate them, express them, talk about them, embody them, all of that.
I imagine in your work you've experienced various forms of pushback. When you're saying it's about practice, I am with you. I agree. What would you say to someone who maybe is feeling a bit hesitant hearing about comprehensive sex ed, talking about sex with youth, bringing sex education, opening these conversations up in schools, someone who's saying practice, like I don't want my teenager to practice. I want them to practice once they're married. How do you respond to pushback when you experience it?
I'm going to talk about what I would call good faith pushback. So not somebody who's just like, I hate what you're doing and want to hurt your feelings and that's it. But, you know, someone who's like, I have legitimate concerns and I want you to know what my concerns, my fears, my worries, my objections are. I will try to express to them like, your feelings are valid. Certainly if you grew up, you know, in this culture, like Western, colonial, Eurocentric culture, you know, there is a massive puritanical influence on our culture that tells us that, sex and sexuality are exactly the same thing, that sex is inherently dangerous, highly risky, damaging, that it is only okay in certain contexts between certain people. It can only be expressed in certain ways, that there is an absolute right and wrong around all of these things. And so if you are someone who is like, I have grown up with these ideas, I've been marinating in them my whole life, and or I just never had the opportunity to interrogate that, and so I've just sort of by default accepted some of that.
And there's fear.
And there's fear. So to have someone come in and be like, you know what, maybe not. That's a lot to take in if you're not sort of already open to it. So just to acknowledge, like, Yeah, those are all like legit feelings. The second thing that I try to impress upon people is like, I am not insisting that you do anything that you don't want to do. One of my colleagues and friends, Emily Nagoski, Dr. Emily Nagoski, who I think is one of the best people doing this work, talks all the time about how sexuality is real and important. Sex is important to certain people, but sex is not necessary. And I think the same thing is true around exploring our sexuality. I'm like, we can explore as much as you want. And if you're like, nope, that's fine. You don't have to. So like for a parent, for example, there's definitely gnarliness there because I can say this as a parent myself. Intellectually, I believe like my child does not belong to me. My child is his own person. Especially when he was younger, I was like, my job here is to like support, to guide. He needs me to not die, literally. But I don't own him, right? I know that intellectually, even now as I'm watching him sort of start to spread his wings and make his own choices, I'm like, I need to let him do that. But it's really hard emotionally because
I can imagine.
I am so connected to him. I am so invested in his well-being. When he hurts, I hurt. So with a parent, I'm like, okay, you think you don't want your kid to have sex until they're married. What I will say is something like, you are absolutely allowed to want that for your child. And you can even express that want to your child. And the framework that I offer for that is, I'm like, that is a value. So what I would suggest is you own that value and say, this is what I believe. I believe that it is important to wait until marriage to have sex. And you can talk about, like, if they're open to it, you can talk about why that's important to you, where that value comes from, what you think. But that's yours. That's what you want for them. And they may be like, that's important to me too. And then afterwards we can have a whole conversation about like, let's talk about a sex positive approach to abstinence, because that's a thing. What I would encourage you to not do in that conversation, to avoid using any myths. And a myth could include something like, people who have sex before marriage are damaged. People who have sex before marriage don't respect themselves. There are also plenty of people who are like, nope, had sex before marriage. I enjoyed it. It was good. Or it was it was fine. Own your values, state your facts, avoid myths.
So 2 kind of questions in terms of sex positive, abstinence-based teaching. 1, can you just give us an overview on what sex positive, quote unquote, sex education even means? And then kind of tell us about how that would apply to an abstinence-based approach.
Yeah, absolutely. So when I talk about sex positivity, the sort of, I guess, brand of sex positivity I practice sometimes is also referred to as sex neutrality. But it basically is an approach to sex that sort of, it exists in contrast to what I was talking about earlier, this model and this perspective on sex where it's like sex, sexuality, and anything related to it has this inherent element of risk, danger, badness to it. It's a philosophy that's been named sex negativity. And so I guess the contrast is sex positivity. But I'm not saying that, oh, okay, then that means that sex and sexuality is all of it's good and all of it's amazing. But my approach is certainly it can be positive, and that's what I hope for people. But basically what I'm saying is sexuality is real. Sexuality exists. It's a way of approaching sexuality where I am trying as much as possible to deconstruct the idea of like hierarchy. So like there's a right and wrong kind of sex. There are good and bad types of bodies. There are good and bad types of sexualities, types of gender expressions that like, no, there's a variety, there's a range. What I try to do in my work is instead of coming in and being like, okay, let me teach you about what's right, I'm like, I want to try to help you figure out how to be okay in your sexuality. I'm not invested in what's universally right or wrong. People ask some variation of the question, am I normal all the time? And my answer is always some variation of, I don't care. That's not what's relevant to me.
Okay. That is not what I thought you were going to say.
Because I'm like,
I love that. I've never heard that. I actually don't care. Yeah.
I'm like, what I care about is you and anyone you're involved with. And I care that you're okay. And if your sexuality extends to anybody else or involves anybody else, I care that they're okay.
So sex positive abstinence. So we've made it, I want to be clear to the listener. We have talked about the importance of sex education and the importance of accepting and practice. And we are sex positive. You know, you're listening to this podcast. We love sex around here.
Absolutely.
I have not come across the idea of sex positive abstinence.
Yeah.
Based teaching. Can you talk more about that?
So first of all, I just want to, address maybe sort of a bit of a myth that might exist sort of more in the sex positive community, which is that abstinence isn't part of this, or that abstinence is the antithesis of sex education, abstinence only, I think, is the absolute antithesis of sex positive or comprehensive sex education. But I think, it can very much be a part of a comprehensive approach because not everybody wants to have sex or not everybody is having sex. So we have the folks who are abstinence by choice is what I call it. And then we have people who are what I would say are abstinent by circumstance. And so a lot of the conversations that I like to have around abstinence and the ideas I like to explore, there are parallel conversations when we're talking about other parts of sexuality or like specifically being sexually active. So like, what is sex? What do you think sex is? Again, it's one of those words where like, I know what that is. And I'm like, okay, but do we though? And when you say to somebody, I want to have sex, what do you mean? Because you don't mean every possible thing. And so I'm like, there's the parallel question. And that's often what I start out with, which is, what is abstinent? Like, there's a general broad definition. It means you are refraining from doing a thing. But I'm like, okay, if we're talking in the context of sex, first I'm like, what do we mean when we say abstinence? And, oftentimes I just do like a popcorn style, like capture. I'm like, just tell me whatever comes to mind. Like, tell me all the ideas. And then if it's in a group, what we usually recognize is I'm like, here's a whole variety of ideas that exist around what abstinence means, because we will get everything from being abstinence means not having specifically penis in vagina sex to being abstinence means not having any physical contact that could be construed as romantic or could even potentially lead to like further sexual behavior. So there are some people for whom practicing abstinence is like, I don't even hold hands with somebody. Like, that is not happening. And it's also things like, can you practice abstinence, for example, if you have previously had sex? So like, I'm happy to share this with your audience. I have not had sex today. Am I abstinent today or not? And so then the next part of the discussion is, okay, there are a lot of different definitions of abstinence, and what abstinence means to one person may be different from another. And so if this is something that you need to convey to other people, how do we start to have these more nuanced, specific conversations? Because while it might feel like very comfortable and we may wish like, I wish I could just say like, okay, I'm abstinent. And then we all agree that there's a definition and then we don't have to talk about it anymore. Doesn't work that way. So like, how do we get into the conversations about this is specifically what I mean when I say that I'm abstinent? And particularly if you are someone where you are what I would say practicing abstinent, you're abstinent by choice, you have made a decision to remain abstinent until whatever, and you get to decide where the end of your abstinence can happen or where you want it to happen. What does that mean? What are you doing? What are you not doing? There are also conversations to be had around abstinence and consent, because for some people who are abstinent, they're like, well, there are still things I am willing to do if I'm in a partnership with somebody. Okay, like, let's talk about those things. Where are your boundaries? And that in the same way that someone who's sexually active can have fluid boundaries, their desires and boundaries can change at any time, that can also happen with abstinence. That you might decide, I'm not going to do A, B, C. I am willing to do X, Y, Z, but today I'm also not willing to do X or Z. Or, okay, some time has passed and now I am willing to do ABC, also X, sometimes Z. You're allowed to have that fluidity, and that's an ongoing thing to be checking in with yourself. And then something else that we talk about, and I think this is true regardless of whether it's abstinence by choice or circumstance, is the intellectual decision to be abstinent, and your physical body may want something and your mind may not. So some people are abstinent because they're like, I am asexual and I have little to no interest, desire, drive, arousal, not my thing. And I'm like, okay. And like, let's talk about that too, and how that is valid and normal. What is that like for people, and how even that exists on a spectrum? But for people who are like, I feel like I am like a sexual being. I have like a body that is sexually responsive, and there is some part of me that's like, that's a fun, juicy feeling, but I'm not gonna act on it. That, yeah, like, let's talk about the fact that desire can still be a real thing for you. Arousal can certainly be a real thing for you. And it is not as simple as, I have made a decision in my head that I'm not going to act on these physical feelings. I am not going to pursue this physical drive, because that is an absolutely valid choice that you can make, that any of us can make, I think, at any time. But that doesn't shut down your body if that's how your body functions. So maybe we can talk about strategies or things you can, like, what are you willing to do or not do? So if you're alone in your room, in your space or whatever, and you get hard, or you're moist and juicy, or you're getting your tingly feelings, and like, you're like, nobody's here, but I really want to touch my body, and that's a really strong urge, what are some things that you might be able to do? What are some tools we can put in your toolbox if you're like, but I really don't want to give into that urge? Because you don't have to. You can have a desire to do something, and it doesn't mean you have to do it. But also talk about, like, it doesn't mean that you're bad or that you're broken, because your body is responding to stimuli. So even talking about things like how, like, desire and arousal are parts of sexual functioning, but they're not the same. That, like, you can be physically aroused and have all the, like, tingly body feelings. The desire is like, I actually want this. And I'm like, you may not desire it, but also you can have desire and not act on a desire. But that's hard. And so we're like, let's talk about, like, maybe it's hard. Let's talk about, what if you slip up and you have to kind of get back on the wagon, so to speak? How do we get back on track? Who can support you in this? All of that.
When you first said sex positive abstinence, I had this reaction, this internal reaction of like, those two things don't go together.
Yeah.
I had I guess based on my own past experiences, reaction. And then now in hearing you talk about it, it's like, of course abstinence is a part of sex positivity. Of course it's a part of comprehensive sex education for all of the reasons that you just listed. And, 3 minutes of hearing you speak about it, and I'm like, this is obvious, and my worldview has shifted. And then in you talking about what even is abstinence to this person or that person, and then what even is sex to this person or that person, I feel like you're kind of sidling towards queer sex education.
Yeah.
And that's almost, I feel like it's like a gateway. You've kind of opened the door to talk about queerness in sex education and where that fits.
So queerness is always part of my sex education. I'm a queer gal myself. It's funny, like, people will be like, when did you come out? And I'm like, I don't feel like I ever did, because I was like, it was something that was always there, but I didn't quite know how to name it. And again, because I was working within sort of different frameworks and understandings of what it meant to be queer, by the time I was like, oh yeah, I'm queer, like I always have been, it's like, I was just like, okay, yeah, whatever. Here's the thing, I'm like, queer people exist. And for me, I'm like, that's just a fact. Like, I am Black, I exist. You're not going to dispute the fact that I'm real and I exist. So I'm like, it doesn't make sense to me for sex ed to not be queer inclusive.
The argument about sex education that includes queer folks. I really do not understand this train of thought that leads you to, well, if I don't teach about queer people, or if we exclude queer people from sexuality education, then we're not going to convince our kids to be queer, or we're not going to convert them.
First of all, that doesn't make any sense. Like, no one would have been queer and then there would be no queer people. Like, if you could just not have queer people by ignoring and not talking about queer people around kids, then no kids would have ever been queer. So what are we even talking about? That's not how that works. That's not how any of this works. Secondly, I'm going to be a little bit gentle, but only a little bit.
Love it.
I object strongly, and again, my belief, that even if talking to kids about queerness made them more likely to be queer, good. Or at least I don't care. What? So? Now I understand that some people believe differently and they're like, I don't think it's cool for kids to be queer. And even if it comes from your religion or your culture, that doesn't negate the fact that you believe that certain people living their lives in a way that does not have to really affect you at all is inherently bad. And it's like, no, that's just part of my culture. Like, yeah, okay, well, that part of your culture is bigoted. Not saying like you need to be ashamed of your whole culture. I'm not saying you need to denounce it, but I'm like, in the same way, I'm like, yeah, my culture has bigotry. Cultures have bigotry in them. I'm going to talk about queerness. I'm just going to do it.
Yeah. You can look at your culture, you can look at your beliefs, you can look at the world, the community that you were raised in, and you can say, oh, I was taught some bigoted things. And you can learn, you can change your mind. Like, I think there's a lot of fear or discomfort around changing your mind.
Yeah.
And it's like, can we normalize and celebrate somebody accessing new information?
Yeah. I don't have a lot of tolerance for bigotry, or at least I don't have a lot of tolerance for trying to name bigotry something other than what it is. But at the same time, for me personally, I also don't believe in throwing people away. I don't even know what that means. The other thing that I want to offer is that if you are someone and you're like, oh, I'm feeling that discomfort because I feel like this person is saying that I'm a bigot. And I'm like, well, yeah, I kind of am. But also, I have been a bigot in certain ways and probably continue to be, because I also have grown up in cultures and societies that, again, propagate this idea of dominance. Like, I am someone who has my entire life had economic privilege and stability, and I am only just now in my very late 40s just starting to grapple with and reconcile ways that has, informed my belief about, people who live in poverty, like the privileges that I have around that and how I have throughout my life wielded that privilege in oppressive ways. I am grappling with, I'm always constantly grappling with sort of the tension between, I am a queer person, but I am a queer person who is in relationship with a straight man. And so optically, I can sort of present as straight, and there is privilege in that. That doesn't mean like, oh, no one should ever criticize me or point it out. And it doesn't mean that I should never feel bad about those things, but it also means I don't think it means that I'm a completely garbage human who doesn't deserve to. It means okay, Nadine, now you know those things, now keep working and try to be better.
I think the difference between saying that a person is a bigot versus their behavior or their belief is bigoted is it's a lot easier to feel like you can grow or change or improve. If someone says to me, oh, that thing that you just said was kind of racist, that I'm going to receive as more, oh, okay, well, what can I learn? What can I change? Tell me more about that. How can I improve this one thing versus someone saying you are a bigot as a whole person?
I also very strongly believe that when you are the target of someone's specific bigoted beliefs or behavior, you are under zero obligation to be the person who holds that space and grace for them. So while I said, like, I don't believe in throwing people away, I absolutely, people will be like, cancel culture. And I'm like, I don't care how people name it, but I'm like, I am absolutely in favor of being like, I am now being targeted and harmed by this bigotry, and I cancel this person. No, we're done. We're done. Like, one of my self-protection rules for myself is that because I'm a sex educator and because I am a cis person, if I see transphobia and I detect, like, okay, somebody is being transphobic and a bigot right now, say in a group or in a class, I will try to engage with that person.
Yes.
And try to offer them information, see if I can at the very least like plant some seeds that might move them away from that bigotry. However, if there is another trans person in that space and I'm like, they're being harmed by this, my first thought is like, I need to first of all shut this down and sort of separate this person from trans people who are getting hurt and do that work with them separately. I'm not going to be like, I can't believe you said that. Get out. I'm never going to talk to you again. You're irredeemable. Because I'm like, because that bigot is still going to move through the world and just be a bigot to other people. But I also am like, yeah, I don't caught into this idea of like, oh, well, I said something maybe inadvertently transphobic and then a trans person got mad at me. How dare they? I'm like, well, yeah, of course they did. And it's not their job to have patience with you.
Yes, that's an important takeaway here too, is that if you are somebody who is in the privileged position, it is our job way more so than it is the person who is in the minority to stand up and fight for this change, because we're the ones that have done the oppressing. Like we need to take some responsibility and use that power because we're in a position of power.
I will say, people ask me a lot of times, like, how do you navigate this in a classroom where like one kid might say something like super problematic? I'm like, it's hard, and I wish I had like this fail-safe formula for how to do it. But I'm like, there are so many different power dynamics at play, because I'm like, if somebody is a kid, they're still learning, but also you can be a kid and cause harm. And the other kid who's being harmed is also a child and also vulnerable. I am an adult. And so I have like so much power over all of these young people, yet at the same time, I'm like, I can't force anyone, including a child, to suddenly believe something differently. So I'm just like, yeah, I'm like, the question is basically like, the question is basically like, how do you make someone like stop believing a thing you want them to stop believing? I'm like, I don't know. It sounds like that's my job, but I'm like, my job as an educator, my job is to sort of show up and share information in however I think it will be easiest for folks to kind of receive it. But I'm like, I'm also pro-choice in terms of reproductive rights, but more broadly, I'm just pro-choice. So I'm like, it is not, I don't see it as my job to show up and be like, you have to take the information I'm offering and use it in this particular way. I'm like, I will offer the information. You can take it and use it. You can take it and file it away for later. You can not take it.
And like that would be putting so much onus on you as a sex educator for that to be an expectation.
Can't do it.
So let's say somebody listening is an educator in some form, or even is a parent who wishes that their kid was getting better sex education in school, but they're either teaching in a district or they live in an area where this is like not an acceptable topic.
Right.
How can we, like me as a person, somebody listening as a person, is there anything that we can do to provide that sort of education or fight back against the powers that be that are saying that these things are inappropriate and not allowed?
So I'm going to address the fight part first. So if you're fighting, an administration, a school board, you might be fighting here in Canada, your province, in the States, your state, in other parts of the world, whatever your, local, regional, federal governments are. Those fights take a long time, but they are worth doing. And so what I would say is don't go it alone. Go out into your community, go online, find other people who also believe in the cause. I would say definitely if you're new to advocacy or activism, look for groups and people who have already been doing the work and connect with them and ask them, how can you support their efforts? Because they will already have, they already have the experience, they already have the knowledge, they already have the infrastructure in place. And these are groups and people who always need more help. And rather than being like day one and you're like, I'm fired up and I'm going to change the system. Me, when I was 25, there are people who have been doing it longer and better than you, and support them. It's just more effective. Donate your money, donate your time, find out who's already doing it and get involved. So if you are someone's, for example, if you're a teacher in a classroom and you want to be doing this thing and you're like, yeah, I want to come in and I want to do all the queer inclusive or even queer centric sex ed, and I want to be pro-choice and sex positive and I have all of these regulations and I can't do it. Do what you can. And what you can do within that context may be super, super teeny. Here in North America, there are constantly laws being proposed, being passed that are putting prohibitions on particularly again around queer inclusive sex ed, where you're not allowed to use certain words, you're not allowed to bring in certain materials. It's really restricting. But there are still little things that you can probably do that will not be in violation of any particular rule. For example, earlier I was talking about, giving a lesson on puberty. I don't know all of the laws and the rules. So yeah, you probably can't, even if you're I can't bring in a book or materials that talk about trans kids having periods. And you can probably still say people who have periods as opposed to when girls have periods. You can use the pronoun they when referring to someone who hasn't been specifically identified as a particular gender. Look for just the little things that you can get in. You're well, loophole, technically this isn't against, do those things. Do what you can, because I now work with and train emerging sex educators. And one thing that I always want to remind people in this field, and whether you're formerly a sex educator like I am, or you're just it's a component of what I do in other parts of my work, none of us are doing this alone and none of us are solely responsible for this. And so you might only be able to plant the teeniest, tiniest seeds. You might only be able to do it in a certain turn of phrase. You might only be able to sneak something into one lesson and get away with it. Mm-hmm. Do what you can.
Yep,
always do what you can, because that matters. And the people who need it often notice. Yeah, so maybe you can't bring in a book, and you may not even be the person in charge of sex ed, but you might be the English teacher, and no, you can't read a book about queerness, but if you know of a book that's just about something else and you're there's a little bit of queer coding in here, or there's a tertiary, there is a slight mention of a same gendered couple in a throwaway sentence, bring in that book. Bring in that book. It will matter.
Do what you can.
Do what you can. Even things you can't do a lesson on sexuality, but maybe you can do a lesson on something like fat liberation and talk about how people in all kinds of different bodies deserve to be treated and deserve to have access to the same things. You could do lessons on, you could bring people in to talk about disability justice, which the principles of which are very strongly connected to a lot of the same principles of sex positivity. Look at other movements and other...
Right, parallel
parallel,
movements.
that sort of have
Yeah.
the same like basic intrinsic values attached to them, where you can talk about, for example, like racial justice. Find some other way to talk about justice, because I also think sex positivity is very deeply rooted in justice and equity. So let's talk about that some other way. Do what you can. But what I would also say to parents, and this is maybe rich coming from me because I'm like, this literally is my job and my area of expertise. You don't have to be an expert to do this with your kid. You do not have to have all of the answers. You do not have to have all of the books. You do not have to have all the resources. If you as a parent are trying, try what you can. You ask the questions when you can think of them, even if you're like, it's awkward and it feels weird. Like, that's fine. If kids know that like, you're like, this is important to me, I'm making the effort, I care how you feel about these things, I care what you think, I care that you're okay, I want to accept you however you are, I really feel like that's kind of the foundation of it all. And then how you execute it, that's kind of the icing on the cake.
That's secondary.
That's secondary. So my concrete suggestions are, in addition to what I said earlier, own your value, state the facts, avoid myths. As much as you can, ask questions, ask open-ended questions. Ask your kids what they think. Ask your kids for their opinions, as opposed to feeling like you have to show up and be like, I am going to impart this information on you so that you take it in, and because they're, again, you can't actually make them think or believe things that they don't want to. But just opening it up as a conversation, like, I'm just curious what you think about this. I'm curious what you think about that. That's number one. My second suggestion, and this is particularly for people who are maybe like, my kid is young and I don't know how to navigate this conversation with a little kid, because a lot of us didn't get those conversations as little kids. So we're like, we don't really have a sense of like, what is the language, the music of like that conversation with like a 6-year-old. If you can, find books about various aspects of sexuality that are written for kids of that age, and you read them to yourself. It will give you a really good framing and will let you capture some language and give you a sense of like, okay, what is the level that we're having? So like, for example,
practice.
It's practice. I keep going back to like, talking about being transgender or trans, because this is a thing people ask me about all the time. There is a book, and it is called Read a Crayon Story. And this is a book
Read a Crayon
Story, and it is by Michael Hall. So the basic synopsis is a very, very simple book. And it is a story about a crayon. The crayon is red. His label is red, but you can see in the book, the crayon is actually blue. It's a blue crayon with a red label on it. And so Red's whole journey is that his teacher, his friends, his family, they're all like, you're a red crayon, draw red things. I'm putting red in quotes. Draw hearts, draw apples, draw whatever. And he keeps trying. And Red's like, that's not right. I can't, I'm not doing, and like, everyone is like very supportive. And they're like, it's okay, like keep trying, blah, 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 blah. And then one day his friend Violet, who is the violet crayon, shows up. I don't know. She's like, I drew like a purple boat or something like, she's like, can you like draw water? And he's like, no, I can't do that. I'm red. And she's like, just try. And then he tries to draw the water.
Giving me goosebumps. Yeah.
And then he's like,
oh my God, I'm going to order this book.
Yeah, I did it. And he's like, oh, I'm blue. Blue. And I think the author's intention in writing it was a story he wrote for his son who was dyslexic. And it was just the idea of you're being told to be one way, and then look what happens when you discover who you actually are. But I read the book and I was like, this is a story about being trans. This is a story about you were told you were one thing and people kept telling you to be this way. Like people kept saying like, oh, you're a girl, you're a girl, you're a girl, you're a girl. And you kept trying to do girl things and you could do it, but it wasn't quite right. And then you did a quote unquote boy thing and it worked. But yeah, this is how
that could
you
be
can,
applicable to so many experiences.
But I'm like, if you're like, I want to talk to my kid about not only gender diversity, but just like that concept of, okay, this is what it means when some people are like, well, when I was born, I was told that I was one way because I came out with like these body parts, but I'm not that. Yeah. That's what that is. And what I think is really interesting about the book is at the end of the book, Red doesn't change his actual external label. Like, he starts calling himself Blue. So I'm like, that is also an opportunity to be like, Red doesn't like sort of quote unquote change his body. He just continues to exist and has this red label, but it's just like, I'm Blue. So it's like, you know, there could be another version where it's like, yeah, he gets like a different label because some people are like, okay, I want other people to like more easily recognize me as being Blue. But maybe for Red, he's like, that's fine. Yeah, I know I'm Blue, or like I might change my label later, or I might not. I haven't decided yet. Like, so like you can take that book and then like, you could ask those questions. Like, do you think Blue will like want to put on a blue label?
I feel like this is going to be a tough question to ask you, but I like to ask, like, in the work that you do, right? If there was one thing that you wish everybody knew, what would it be? But that's a tough one because you're an educator. So
it is. Okay. So if everyone knew this, I wouldn't have a job anymore, but maybe I would be okay with that. And then I would like go and, I don't know, be like a interior designer, or like maybe I would be like a reality TV podcaster. Who knows? It sounds so simple, but I feel like it's such a challenging thing. You're fine. You're fine. You're fine. You were born fine. You've always been fine. You are fine. You have nothing to prove.
Okay, I think that is like the perfect place to sum this up. I have one more kind of question I'd like to ask you about over on the Patreon exclusive, if you have a few extra minutes. So if you're interested in hearing, I want to ask you about the misconceptions around sex ed. Like, what are the big myths that folks have? So if you're interested in hearing the extended version of this episode, you can head over to the Patreon. It's linked in the show notes. But for the regular listeners, thank you for being here. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise. Where can people find you?
You can go to my Instagram. I haven't posted on it in a long time, but there's like a bunch of back posts you can look at, Nadine Thornhill. You can check out my YouTube channel, which is Nadine Thornhill. You can go to my website, NadineThornhill.com/newsletter. And there's a sign-up sheet, and you can sign up for my newsletter, and we can chat. And if like you're just generally like, where am I? Just Google Nadine Thornhill. Oh, and I also have a web series for tweens. It's called Everybody Curious. So you can go to everybodycurious.com and watch the episodes.
Thanks for listening. You can also access all of our extended cut episodes with bonus content from every single guest over on Patreon at patreon.com/AlenaJoy. That's patreon.com/ALAYNAJoy. And be sure to follow us on Instagram at SleepingAroundPod for updates, teasers, episode discussions, and more. This episode was produced by Elena Joy and Danae Fender and edited by Corey Mosqueda. See you next time back here on the couch.